I'm one of the co-organizers, and let's pay attention to the recording. Carolina, are we recording?
Yes, I just started the recording. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Okay, so we're welcome everyone to one of our continuing series of Leeds University Business School COVID lockdown webinar series, which look at different aspects both of economic theory, finance and management theory, as well as practical aspects of living that are relevant, especially to the lockdown period. And we're very happy to say, first of all, that we'll be continuing through July. We're not fully booked exactly, but Tuesday and Thursday we will have some activities that will be going on. On this coming Thursday, we're going to have a presentation by Carrie Unsworth of the Management Division. And that will be this Thursday at 4 o'clock. Next Tuesday, a week from today at 4, we're going to have a very nice talk by our new dean, Julia Bennett. Julie will be talking about the role of business schools, especially in light of the COVID and the other kind of challenges facing the nation these days, nation and the region. Today, we're honored to have with us Professor Peter Howley. Peter is a colleague of mine in the economics division. He's had a distinguished career in which he's been working both in agricultural development. He's worked in Galway. He's been an academic. He's worked for a variety of organizations that are important in terms of economic policy, ranging from the Nuffield Foundation to the Economic Protection Agency of Ireland. He's got a great range of experience. He's now a professor of behavioral economics with us at the University of Leeds. He describes his own research as eclectic and interdisciplinary, but I have to say that we find him to be the most congenial colleague, always involved and helping out his fellows. And I think that it won't surprise you then that his topic today is the long-term implications of COVID-19 for our happiness. And I'm going to mute myself right now, and we'll leave the floor to Peter. And as I mentioned in my welcoming chat box, you'll see a chat area available to you. And as Peter talks, please put questions that arise to you into the chat area, and we'll go to those and pose those questions for Peter when his talk is finished. Peter, take it away.
Thanks for the kind words, Gary. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this business school webinar. What I hope to do here is to provide some insight into just some of the potential long-term implications of the coronavirus pandemic for our psychological as opposed to necessarily economic well-being, as there can be some differences. In keeping with the business or policy-focused theme of these webinars, I will be focusing in particular on the following three issues. These are firstly, the changing nature of work practices and the subsequent consequences of these changes for our happiness, unemployment, income and inequality, and the trade-offs, potential trade-offs therein. So perhaps a good question to start off with is why study happiness? This is something I'm commonly asked, and usually my answer always starts with the following, which is why not? Why the obsession with other metrics of well-being, namely objective measures such as GDP and income? They all have their relative merits, of course, but I would contend a true picture of societal well-being can only be gathered by a consideration of both objective with subjective indicators. Even as some of the original creators of the concept of the GDP or national income have pointed towards limitations. For example, Simon Kuznets is quoted as saying the welfare of a nation can scarcely be inferred from a measure of national income. And there is some there seems to be some interesting trade-offs between GDP and happiness. And by that I mean, despite rapid increases in economic growth over time, happiness has remained relatively static in the UK over the last few decades. It's actually fallen in some countries, the US being the most notable exception. And of course, the pursuit of rising incomes has other negative externalities in economic speak, such as environmental damage, which threaten the welfare of future generations. A good counterpoint in support of the pursuit of rising incomes is that it has, of course, led to a big change in our life expectancy. And that's an important point. But even that is beginning to change. I took note of some recent stats coming from the Office for National Statistics, which suggests that we may be beginning to reach a plateau here in that increasing chronic diseases associated with a consumer's lifestyle are beginning to take hold. So what do we mean by happiness? In essence, it's how individuals feel themselves, about the quality of their life, or happiness, or life satisfaction. So in essence, it's a self-reported measure. There are a number of different classifications, but perhaps a good one would be to characterize two big groupings, and they are context-free, which would be whereby individuals would be asked to rate their quality of life as a whole, or context-specific. Context-specific would be satisfaction with a particularly important domain of overall life satisfaction, such as job satisfaction. Now, when it comes to economists, they have tended to focus on objective measures when determining well-being, be it income and wealth at the individual level or national income, GDP at the macro level. There's a much longer tradition in other social science disciplines of using happiness, particularly psychology, but sociology. Here it's viewed as natural that a concept such as welfare should be studied in part by asking how people they themselves feel. And I should say, fortunately, within the economic sphere, consideration of these subjective indicators of well-being are becoming much more common. So what do the numbers mean? So the numbers are subjective, and I guess that's the biggest potential criticism associated with a self-reported happiness measure. For instance, if an individual scores themselves 7 out of 10, that does not necessarily mean that that individual is happier than someone with a score of 6. But the typical way that researchers get around this problem is to actually track the same people over time, typically large numbers of individuals. So by doing this, we can see how individuals' own well-being evolves over time in response to changing life circumstances or other shocks, and why. So in essence, each individual acts as their own control. And social scientists call this within as opposed to between variation. So as we are comparing the same people over time, as opposed to comparing individual A to individual B, we avoid the problems associated with interpersonal comparisons and the subjective nature of these assessments. So first, I suppose, core issue that I'm going to look at a little bit today is in relation to work. So good question to start off here is, does work make us happy? It's perhaps interesting to observe standard economic theory in this regard, and here it is typically assumed that work is a source of disutility. In other words, it's something that we need to engage in order to enjoy leisure and extra consumption opportunities. There is a lot of research now to suggest that this would be an overly simplistic view of the relationship between work and welfare. For instance, people don't react to economic stimuli in the way that would be predicted if people purely viewed work as a source of disutility. For example, people don't react to rising levels of unemployment benefits in the way that would be predicted. For instance, if benefits increase, you would predict that people at lower would withdraw work effort. This happens, but not nearly to the degree that would be predicted if people solely viewed work as a source of disutility. Additionally, another example, there's lots of these small-scale field experiments over the last number of decades, beginning in the US, 1960s, that have looked at the relationship between basic incomes and individuals' labour market behaviour. Now, basic income would be this idea where individuals are paid a set amount of money irrespective of their participation in the labour market. The fear of such a policy would be that large numbers of individuals, particularly those on low pay, would withdraw from the labour market because it would be rational for them to do so based on a cost-benefit calculation on pure monetary terms. So while we observe this happens to some degree in the field experiments that have been undertaken, it's by no means as substantive, which suggests that for a large number of individuals at least, work is something more than just a source to make money. In other disciplines, there is more greater and deeper recognition of the importance of work for our happiness. One characterization that I'm particularly fond of is some work by sociologists who have characterized work as providing vitamins of life. That is core or important psychological functions that will be beneficial for our psychological health and well-being in the same way that vitamins are beneficial for our physical health. Of course, a lot depends on the job. We must not lose sight of this fact. It's many cases, it's easy for me to talk about the benefits of work for well-being, given a high degree of job security, autonomy, variety, and able to do things like this, for example. And so I am very much speaking in generalities. By that, I mean particular job characteristics are associated with adverse consequences on mental health. But by and large, there is scope for work to be beneficial for people's well-being, and it is for large numbers of individuals. So let's look at work in a post-coronavirus world. There has been this almost unprecedented transformation in work practices. I guess unprecedented to the extent that it happened so quickly. The biggest one being, I guess, this working from home. And a useful question, I guess, that we need to ask is, does working from home make people happy? I would say we don't really know. My suspicion is that there has been a rush to conclude that working from home is beneficial for both productivity and happiness, and maybe it is, but I think we need to do an awful lot more to establish that. And the reason I say this is the following. A lot of the research that's been conducted on this issue to date has not really compared like with like. By that I mean it might compare the well-being of individuals who work from home with the well-being of individuals who work in office or other environments. But those individuals are very different, and the job characteristics are very different. So we don't really know. It's hard to disentangle working from home from these other differences. Even if we look at the same individuals over time, oftentimes individuals who transition from working in an office to working from home, it's a result of them wanting to make that transition. So those individuals themselves maybe not be representative of everybody in society. The lockdown and this transformation in working practices will serve as a really good natural experiment for uncovering these impacts in the months and years to come. The reason I say a natural experiment is that individuals have been forced to change their working practices as opposed to chosen themselves to changing their work practices. We'll be hearing the word natural experiment and coronavirus lockdown a lot over the coming years in examining a host of issues, be it the benefits of reductions in air pollution, cost of social isolation, and so forth. In any case, when it comes to this issue, I think the more interesting question for me is not necessarily whether working from home is beneficial for happiness on average, but rather what groups are most likely to be negatively impacted, and what mechanisms we can put in place to mitigate these negative effects, if indeed there are any negative impacts. When it comes to happiness in the workplace, one thing that's sometimes overlooked is that happiness itself can shape labour market outcomes. By that I mean is a two-way relationship. That often happier workers are themselves more productive, and this can increase firm performance. One of the mechanisms for this is that happier workers tend to be more engaged in the success otherwise of their place of work. In relation to what drives these differences in life satisfaction, pay is the obvious starting point here, and this is of course very important. But beyond that, there are a number of other aspects that are predictive of happiness. There is, for example, a general pattern of blue collar versus white collar differences. And this probably relates to differences in the tasks involved in these different categories of work. In addition to pay comparisons are also very important, particularly if people perceive an unfairness in it, that some individuals are paid more for doing the same job. Work-life balance is important. Variety, autonomy is particularly important. Value of feeling valued, job security, social capital. I suppose social capital is one aspect that would change in particular as a result of transitioning into working at home. Workplace politics, or rather the lack of, is also important, a component of satisfaction with one's job. Now let's just quickly move on. Unemployment. It would be no surprise to anyone that unemployment makes us happy. But what is, I think, interesting to observe in this literature is that it hurts far, far more than what people generally think. And to give you an illustration, if you were to compensate people for any income losses associated with the transition from employment to unemployment, that in of itself would only account for a relatively small proportion of the overall loss in psychological well-being associated with unemployment. In short, it's the non-pecuniary effects associated with unemployment that seems much more impactful for happiness than the pecuniary impacts associated with a reduction in income. So why are the non-pecuniary impacts so impactful? I think perhaps the two biggest ones, they're both interrelated, I guess, is strong social norm to work, and also the shame and stigma from not working. And I think these are probably two reasons for why unemployment in the UK remains relatively low, even in the face of declining levels of job quality and objective characteristics. Social relations, daily structures can also be important components of individuals' life satisfaction, and they could be lost when transitioning from employment to unemployment. In relation to the coronavirus and unemployment, I just had a quick look at some figures, and they surprised me actually just in the last couple of days. The extent of the unemployment is what surprised me. 9.3 million furloughed at the end of June and 2.5 million self-employed claiming income support in the UK. So this would suggest that close to 50% of the workforce are either unemployed or underemployed. And this could, in of itself, could have long-term consequences for people's health and well-being, even if employment recovers. This is because there's the potential for these long-term scarring effects for people's mental health associated with unemployment. This, of course, will vary from person to person, and it will be contingent on the amount of time that people spend unemployed. And that's an open question. We don't know to what extent employment will recover, and if it does recover, how quickly. Another notable characteristic of unemployment is that people don't adapt very well to unemployment when it comes to happiness. And by that I mean unemployment hurts, but it stays hurtful. In contrast to some other negative life events, people can adapt to some degree, but this doesn't seem to be very evident when it comes to unemployment. There are these negative externalities associated with unemployment as well, in that individual unemployment can have negative effects on others, and others being individuals that are closely tied to a particular individual, be it spouses, children, and neighbours. In terms of what should we do, I guess this in of itself is a research question, and it's something that could be the focus of a webinar. As a starting point, I suggest that to the greatest extent possible, we start to think of work and unemployment, and I guess I'm thinking of policy making in this regard. It's not purely thought of in economic terms. It's not just a means to make money, it's closely tied up into people's sense of identity and well-being. Minimizing unemployment is of course important, but job quality is also important consideration too. Finding income. Does money buy happiness? And the answer is yes, it sure does. But I guess what's interesting here is not by as much as people typically think. I don't have time really to go into the rich variety of other characteristics that are associated with individuals' happiness, but while it is important, it matters far less than many of these other characteristics. What seems to be much more important income for people's happiness is relative as opposed to absolute levels. That is where people's position in the income distribution seems to be more impactful than actually their overall income figure. And it's one reason put forward as to why happiness has remained relatively static despite rising levels of income. That way, there's these countervailing forces almost. Incomes have increased, which is beneficial for happiness, but inequality has also increased, which is detrimental. Thought of experiment that I posed to my students to illustrate, I guess, the power of these relative income comparisons is this scenario, and it might be worth just running quickly through it. And it's asking individuals to make, our students to make this choice. And it's option A, new job earning 30,000 upon graduation, but all your classmates earn 25,000. Or option B, a new job earning 35,000, but all your classmates earn 40,000. Which makes you better off, and what would you choose? Now, of course, everybody will recognize that option B is the one that makes you better off. But even among economist students, many of them will actually readily admit that they would choose option A. It's lower income, but you're trading off more income to be to be better off than your peers. But many students would admit that they would choose option A. It's interesting when I ask students this question because it can cause a lot of almost a stress, because some students will perceive others behaving very irrationally and not readily understand why. So as I mentioned, rising inequality is offered up as one potential explanation for static or declining happiness levels. This provides just a very quick graphical illustration of inequality in the UK and the United States and other developed English-speaking countries. The first part of the graph, which is where you will see a U-shaped, this has got the United States, which is in purple, the United Kingdom, which is in yellow. So in terms of the pattern of inequality over time, I guess in the early part of the last century, inequality was quite high. It was approximating 20% of the total income going to approximately 1% of the population. So, and this rapidly declined after World War I, in particular World War II. So you will see in the 1980s, it fell to between 5 and 10% in most countries, but then there was a rapid uptick in inequality in the post-1980 period. And again, this is perhaps one potential explanation, one of many, for why people's happiness has not moved in the same fashion as rising incomes. While the average income has increased, inequality, the gaps between people has widened. In other countries, it's a little bit different. For example, Scandinavian countries is the obvious example, but also continental Europe and Japan. So in these countries, on the right side of the graph, where you'll see more of an L shape, you will see here that inequality has decreased quite rapidly up until the 1980s, similar to the UK and the US. But there wasn't that rapid upturn in inequality after the 1980s. It stayed relatively low, so more of an L-shaped. If we look at wealth instead of income, the picture is a little bit even more stark. In 2010, for example, the last year for which data on this is readily available, just under half of all wealth in the UK was held by the richest 10%. whereas the poorest 10% held only at 1%. So in terms of the coronavirus and income inequality, I think everybody would recognize that as the poorest in societies that seems to be most adversely impacted, both in terms of their economic well-being and health. But of course, there's a significant degree of interrelationship between these two factors here. Fortunately, lots of money has been thrown at this through the government, our furlough scheme. But going forward, it's an open question as to what supportive measures will be put in place. And the difficulty here is that maybe these trade-offs between income and inequality, and we don't really know which way the governmental policy response will follow. And by trade-offs, I mean that I guess I'm presenting a very simplistic view, and some economists would quite reasonably question it in that there's a lot of nuance that I'm missing out on. A good rule of thumb is that there can be a trade-off between the size of the pie, that is the total amount of income, and the distribution. And the difficulty here when it comes to implementing steps to mitigate inequality, perfectly reasonable people will just have simply different preferences. Some people will much prefer to trade off more inequality for greater levels of income. And it's not as simple as they're better off preferring the status quo, i.e. high levels of inequality. Indeed, many of the wealthiest individuals in society are the ones most often in favour of policies aimed at mitigating income inequality, such as increase in taxation rates, whereas the least well off in society are the ones who would be most against policies that would be to their benefit. The causes and the reasons for this are multifaceted, but perhaps some potential issues, some issues here relate to cultural differences. For example, there are just some cultural differences between, for example, Scandinavian countries and other English-speaking countries. Trust is a big issue here, and here there's this inherent, paradox in that inequality fosters trust, distrust in people, and just distrust in government. And so when that happens, people are less likely to be tolerant of further increases in taxation because they don't trust it will be spent correctly for their benefit. In addition, people tend to be upward as opposed to downward looking when it comes to comparing themselves or income comparisons. In other words, there is always somebody better off than me that I want to catch. And oftentimes it's perceived that the somebody that's better off is there because of some unfairness. So they're less likely to tolerate any barriers that would prevent them from increasing their wealth to appear as a higher level. Suspect misinformation is a factor, if not the biggest factor here. By that I mean the world is a far, far more random place than what people think. People tend to overestimate the impact of hard work, talent, and ability, which is of course important, but they also tend to underestimate the effect of life circumstances and luck along the way, which is equally, if not more important, in determining where you end up in life. And I suspect it'd be something I'd be interested to test out, that if people were more aware of this kind of randomness in life, that they may be more tolerant of inequality reducing policies. It's just a final point now when it comes to the policy response. As I've hinted at, I suppose one potential concern is that the quickest way to bring GDP back to pre-existing levels post-coronavirus pandemic may exacerbate pre-existing inequalities. And as we have seen, this will have significant consequences for our well-being. In other words, it's easier to go fast if you're not concerned with inequality. I think some of the rhetoric post-Brexit is instructive in this regard. It's perhaps, maybe it's fair to say it's suggestive of more concern with absolute income distribution. And by that I mean a lot of the benefits put forward in favour of Brexit's concern with deregulation of labour markets and environmental protections. And this may in turn foster growth, but it will have, these measures are designed to protect quite often the poorest members in society. Going forward, there's lots of indirect costs too for the better off from rising, I should say that should be rising equality. We need to do a better job of presenting this message. For example, greater levels of equality can foster social trust and sense of belonging. Inequality, in addition, fosters social strife. I think it's fair to say, for example, that the divisions over Brexit had as much to do with economic and social divisions as opposed to people's support or otherwise for the EU. So that's it. Thanks for your attention, and any questions are most welcome.
Thank you, Peter. I've got a problem.
Sorry, Gary, I couldn't hear you. Can anybody hear me? Hello, can anybody hear me? Okay, yeah, I see somebody, Adrian, lost Gary. Will I have a look at the chat and see if there's any questions, or does anybody there want to do that? Okay, Neil, if I read this, do you think the relative income effect is actually rational in a smaller tribal setting, but is another artifact of evolutionary biology lagging behind societal development? My thinking is that is a far too smart of a question for me, Neil.
I can elaborate if you want. I wasn't going to bother you this time, but I just had the thought as you started talking about it.
Okay, do elaborate, because I actually think you're right, and it's a really interesting thing that a lot of these issues have to do with these evolutionary considerations. But do you want to have a comment?
So yeah, so your example was something like if you asked people a choice between 30,000 and everyone else has 25,000 versus you have 35,000 but everyone else has 40,000, a lot of people might want to pick the first option even though they have less money overall. And I'm thinking that if you're in a small tribe, then that first option might actually make sense because overall you have more relative income than everyone else in your tribe, and therefore you would probably have more purchasing power overall. So that 30,000 would actually be worth more anyway. So maybe the kind of heuristic that's going on in people's minds is, well, if I have more money than other people, then actually I can kind of take more of a share of all the goods that are available. And so in effect, I kind of have more money. Whereas it's almost kind of like saying that inflating the figure doesn't really make a difference. It's kind of the proportion that I get of the pie. And that might make a difference when the tribe is isolated and so there's no one else external in the economy. But when you start to expand, then obviously that effect doesn't really matter, because even if you're richer than your peer group, it doesn't really make much of a dent in like the overall population. So I wonder whether that's somehow related to why people might actually come to that conclusion.
Yeah, very. Yeah, I suspect. Yeah, it seems intuitively sensible. I guess there is some. In addition to that, it's similar argument could be made in relation to power. That in a small tribe, having more power may be particularly important. Yes, when you have even just a little bit more income, you have more power. But yeah, might be an interesting thing to test out. But it is fascinating the degree to which there are evolutionary explanations for what can often look like irrational behavior.
Next paper, Peter.
I've lost track now of the chat. Does anybody else have any other questions? I don't see any.
Hi Peter, this is Sarah. Can you see Gary's posted a couple of extra questions in there? One is how to improve the well-being of leaders in the education sector.
Yes. In the short answer, I don't know what would be very distinctive in relation to leaders in the education sector when it comes to improving their well-being relative to other sectors in society. So I guess we're kind of delving into a different research topic or research question that was discussed here, but I guess there may be some insights in relation to how to foster work happiness in a general sense. So I think there was an earlier slide when I spoke quickly about what matters to people when it comes to their employment in terms of happiness. These relate from everything from actual pay to pay comparisons, work-life balance, autonomy, variety, feeling valued, social capital, and so forth. Hope that answers the question as best I can.
Yeah. Oh, I think Gary might be back now.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
I am back. Thank you for your patience and for jumping in, Sarah. I appreciate that. Am I reasonably clear?
Yeah, it's perfect, Gary.
Good. So let's go to Clemens.
Yeah, Peter, thank you for the very interesting talk. I think you've focused a lot on the immediate effects of the pandemic, like the effects on unemployed people and their well-being. And I perfectly agree with what you have said, or I mean, it makes perfect sense to me. But what about the other scarring effects, the more long-term effects? And here, my biggest concern is probably education at schools and universities. So the lost month, the lost years, or the different kinds of education that people can enjoy currently, and perhaps a lower level of quantity and quality of human capital they acquire. Do you share this concern, or is this something you think that people will be quickly able to make up or catch up, or yeah?
The short answer, Clemens, I don't know, but I suspect that they won't be able to catch up as quickly as that. And the reason I would say that is that there is a lot of research in this area that hasn't necessarily used the coronavirus, but they have looked at interventions or negative shocks, which has reduced people's amount of schooling, or that have prevented people from taking up or prevented people from pursuing education in the fashion that they would otherwise do. This would suggest that there can be long-term consequences. It's particularly problematic for children in that what happens often in childhood can be predictive of adult outcomes. And that's going to be a big worry. And I guess it's something that government is going to have to get on top of. That even if, I guess, as you say, that even if education bounces back or employment bounces back, maybe these long-term consequences that will be impactful for generations to come. Even beyond that, I guess there's interesting questions in relation to the social isolation. So I suspect social isolation is a little bit more straightforward than education, and that people will bounce back. But there could also be like unemployment potential for varying effects. There will also be, I guess, a greater level of general worry, just worry and anxiety that may not ultimately recover in the short run, even once the coronavirus is, even if there is a vaccine for the coronavirus, for example, people may be have more worry or anxiety as to what the future may hold. But in short, Clemens, yeah, just interesting question in relation to the long-term consequences, particularly in relation to education, and I suspect they will be very impactful indeed.
If I could jump in with a question that I had, you talked about furlough. Furlough's been very important for keeping people calm in some ways. I think my audio is still not good, huh?
Fine, Gary, I can hear you perfectly.
Okay, thank you. I'm sorry for that. I'll check it later. But just to say that in the U.S., there's no furlough policy. There are 39 or more million people that have been laid off. And I wonder whether that rupture that you emphasized is part of the reason for the extreme violence and emotional and other reactions we're seeing in the streets in the U.S. People are frustrated and very, very unhappy. Of course, there are many reasons for that, but one aspect is job loss and layoff is so devastating for people in our world.
Yeah, that's very true, Gary. And even looking at here, if we go back to the 1980s, there was a high and persistent degree of unemployment, and that was a source of social strife too. And yeah, I think something perhaps that we need to be more cognizant of, but not just unemployment, but I guess when we have these gaps between people, there's a tendency for people to become socially segregated. This has so many other far-reaching consequences for not just happiness, but in terms of social trust, belonging, solidarity, and so forth. And that's something that we need to perhaps be more cognizant of going forward.
I appreciate that, and I see that actually Linda Song, Professor Song, is in the audience, and Linda gave a very interesting talk last week on the fact that there were good organizational responses to COVID had to do with planning and people working together strategically in firms. And actually, that's been a topic of great interest here. I just came from a meeting with the West Yorkshire Combined Authority talking about the recovery strategy. But it raises the question of, are those strategies that will leave some people working at home, or even forcing some people to leave the firm so that the firm can be more efficient and survivable as roles shift and labor market needs shift, so that there's really many questions about this transition that we're in.
Yeah, I think a lot of the transitions that have happened would ultimately have happened. It's just that they've accelerated them. And in many ways, research hasn't caught up because all these transitions have happened so quickly. We don't really know what the long-term consequences are. And quite often, I suspect that another thing that's commonly overlooked is there may be substantive differences between the short-term versus long-term consequences. Working from home is the obvious example. When it comes to productivity and happiness, the impact in the short run may be very different in the medium and long term. But again, it's an open-ended question as far as I can see.
Yeah, and of course, I as you raised that question about that you pose for your students, I was wondering, how do your students answer that question, and how would they answer it maybe today versus some years ago? There was a period of time when all of my students at the University of California wanted to work in the banking sector and become millionaires. And I wonder how they're thinking now. How have students responded to that? And what have they felt about that experiment you've done?
I think it does open their eyes up in that oftentimes they get to choose the scenario where they have less money, but more than their peers. And oftentimes it leads to some self-reflection as to why they make those choices. But I guess another interesting feature of those choices is there's a significant number of students that would clearly not make that choice, and they don't understand why other individuals are choosing something that's perceived as irrational. And that's in of itself interesting to observe.
Yeah, yeah. It goes to the heart of that absolute versus relative aspect, doesn't it?
Yeah, and maybe it's an interesting hypothesis to actually see if these things change over time, particularly in this pandemic. I guess I've spoken quite a lot of the potential negative impacts, but guess perhaps one potentially beneficial aspect is that it has demonstrated the importance of solidarity and bringing people together and community togetherness and social capital and working together to solve problems, and also brought a greater level of recognition for people who would be perhaps lower paid as but providing very important services for the UK.
Appreciate that. I see that Kevin Rouse has unmuted himself. Kevin, do you want to come in with a question? I think maybe I misinterpreted. Kevin?
No pressure, Kevin.
I think let's look at the chat bar. Did you, while I was offline, Peter, did you have a chance to look at the two questions that people had posed for you from the prior to the seminar?
Yes, actually, I answered the first question at least, and the second question I think indirectly has been commented on through the variety of other questions that people have posed.
I appreciate that.
Are there spoke about educational consequences in the long term?
Yes. Well, let's see. If there are there other questions that people would like to pose? And I think if we're at an equipoise, maybe we might ask Peter, are there any final comments you'd like to make? This question of happiness, I think, weighs on our minds very profoundly these days. There's the questions that have been raised about education, children, solidarity, workplace. These go to the core of what we think it means, really, to Neil's comment about being human beings in human society these days. I suspect we haven't seen the last of the reflections we're going to need to have about what we really want from life, we as a society, as we go forward. Any final?
I think, Gary, we should end it there. I think we should end it there because you have provided a much better summary thoughts than I could possibly have done. So thank you for that.
Well, I appreciate that. Let's all give a virtual thank you to Peter for hosting the event today. And that I think Adriana had said, happiness increases with physical interactions and the possibility to move freedom. No doubt freely, no doubt about it. And we hope that one day our virtual thanks can turn into a face-to-face hug very soon. Thank you again, and everybody have a great day. We hope to see you on Thursday when we're going to have our own Carrie Unsworth to make a presentation for everyone, 4 o'clock on Thursday. Thanks very much. Thank you, Peter. Carolina and Sarah.